Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about the trial of Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, Saint Thomas More, someone else who was ultimately canonised by the Catholic Church. It's a trial that's probably best known for its representations on stage and on screen. But the event itself, so far as we know, was a real drama in its own right. Maybe not the result, the outcome, which was known, but the face-off in a courtroom between accusers and accused. And it was also very revealing about how power worked in the time of Henry VIII and beyond. There are two celebrated stage and screen versions of the trial of Thomas More. One is in A Man for All Seasons, Robert Bolt's play. It was originally a radio play. It was then put on the West End stage in 1960. It became a very well-known film in 1966, starring Paul Scofield as Thomas More. And the other is in Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel's great trilogy of novels, which also became a play, a West End play, and is probably now best known for the BBC dramatisation. In the Hilary Mantel version, Wolf Hall, the trial itself doesn't feature so much as the interrogations leading up to it, because the leading character in Wolf Hall is Thomas Cromwell, who was very present in the interrogations of Thomas More, but not at the trial itself. In A Man for All Seasons, the trial, based, I think, quite closely on the transcript, features at the end of the play as its climax, its set piece. But nonetheless, these two versions of the downfall of Thomas More are like mirror images of each other. They're kind of through the looking glass, in that in A Man for All Seasons, More is the hero. And he comes across, he's written by Robert Bolt, as sensitive, wry, quite humorous, ironic. A man of conscience, a man of real conscience, caught in a terrible position, caught between the demands of his master, his king, Henry VIII, and what he thinks his conscience and his church require of him. And in the end, it costs him his life, and it's heartrending. There are scenes with his family which really are heartrending. Thomas Cromwell, in A Man for All Seasons, is a thug. He's not the arch villain, and there are sympathetic aspects to his portrayal in the sense that he's also a little bit funny, and he can be wry when the occasion requires it, but he's a nasty piece of work. He's out to get More, and the implication is also he's jealous of More. He's a social climber, and he wants the status, the position that More has. He's a little in awe of More and his intellect, and he's determined to pull him down. In the Hilary Mantel version, Thomas Cromwell is the hero, and he is portrayed by Mantel as a wry, self-aware, quite sympathetic man. He is a thug. She doesn't deny he's a thug, and he's certainly capable of nastiness and violence. But we get to see inside his head in the way that in A Man for All Seasons we get to see, or at least to think we can see, inside Thomas More's head. In the Hilary Mantel version, it's More who is the caricature, essentially. So More in that version is a prig, a hypocrite, sanctimonious, particularly as played by Anton Lesser in the BBC version. He's really annoying. And his hypocrisy extends to being a man of conscience who's perfectly happy to do the nastiest stuff that the age requires, up to and including torture of people he thinks are his enemies, people he has deemed to be heretical. So in both cases, there is a really rounded portrait of one of these two individuals, and then a thin, or thinnish anyway, caricature of the other. I have no idea which one is right. My guess is that both Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell were closer to the rounded version than the pure caricature, in the sense that these were remarkable men of extraordinary talents, and they didn't achieve what they achieved by being this thin caricature version that we get in the two dramatisations. But they probably weren't rounded in the way that Robert Bolt and Hilary Mantel make them rounded for us, in the sense they are written up as modern people, psychologically plausible modern people whose thinking we can understand and relate to. Their dilemmas, their agonies, in a way, are things that are relatable for a 20th or 21st century audience. And my guess is that that wouldn't be right, that these were men from a completely different age, a much less rational age than ours, a more superstitious age, a profoundly more religious age. And we wouldn't find that if we encountered them, their thinking was so accessible to us. So my guess is the truth is somewhere between these two versions. But despite the real difference between Robert Bolt's Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell and Hilary Mantel's Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, there are lots of interesting overlaps between the two stories. One of which is both men were lawyers. So this is a tale of two lawyers, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell. Neither of them were clerics or bishops, or though they were both profoundly involved in religious matters and religious controversies. They were by profession lawyers and became the chief lawyer in the land, Lord Chancellor. But they saw the law differently. So there's also a kind of mirroring in how they understood the law. I think, at least by the time of his trial, and it's there in the transcript of the trial, and it becomes a big theme of Robert Bolt's play, Thomas More saw the law as a kind of shield or protection. It was there to protect individuals from the things that might intrude, infiltrate their lives, including ultimately in his own defense. He says the law is there to protect the conscience of individuals. There's a famous line in A Man for All Seasons where More says that the law is like a forest or a set of trees. It's what protects people from the wind, the wild wind. And if all the trees are down, what will protect them? I think it's probably easier just to say that it's a shield. It's a shield that can be used as a defense. Whereas for Thomas Cromwell, the law was more like a tool than a shield, an instrument to be used not just to protect, but to prize things out of people, to change things, to get things done, to reform the state, but also to achieve access, maybe even to people's beliefs, but if not to their beliefs, certainly to their assets and their points of weakness as well. It's a nastier business, I think, in the hands of Cromwell than of More, but More did some really, really nasty things in the name, at least, of higher religious laws. So it's not a straightforward contrast. And it's also true that a shield can be a tool in the sense you can use a shield. Even if you think the law is a shield, you can use it to beat people with. And More did a bit of that. And it's also true that a tool can be a kind of shield in the sense that even if you think the law is there to be used to do things, if you are able to use it to do things, you can protect yourself. Cromwell protected himself with the law as well as using it to prize things out of people. More beat people with the law as well as using it to protect himself. But still, I think there is a difference between law as a shield, law as a tool. And I think it matters for their respective fates. The other thing these stories have in common is they do share a common villain. And in the dramatizations, the villain is absolutely identified as the really nasty piece of work. That is a man called Richard Rich, who is kind of notorious in English history as one of the bad guys. He's a wrong 'un. And he was instrumental in the downfall of Thomas More. He was instrumental in the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, which only happened 5 years later. 1535, More was executed. Cromwell was behind it. 1540, Cromwell met a similar fate. The common theme is that in each case, Richard Rich, who had been a protege first of More, then of Cromwell, when it was clear that his man was in trouble and indeed potentially on the way out, turned and betrayed, turned as a witness against first More and then Cromwell, played a key part in the interrogation and then testified in both cases. In Cromwell's case, we don't actually have the transcript. In More's case, we do. Testified against them in a way that made their condemnation certain. The evidence that Richard Rich gave against Thomas More was the key evidence in More's trial. More had been held for a long time in the Tower of London. The attempt was to break him, to get him to condemn himself out of his own mouth. He wasn't tortured, but he was, by our standards, tortured, psychologically tortured. He would have been threatened, threats made against his family, deprived of books, no doubt of sleep, occasionally of food, in the hope that he would eventually crack. It seems that he didn't crack. What his accusers wanted him to do was to confess that the the reason he wouldn't take the oath that was required of men like him, thanks to a new Act of Parliament confirming Henry VIII, as the head of the church, because Henry needed to be the head of the church in order, first of all, to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and then to marry Anne Boleyn, because the Pope wouldn't allow it. It's that story. And I'll say more about that story in a moment. What More's accusers needed from him was a confession that the reason he wouldn't take that oath is because he did not believe that Henry was the legitimate head of the church, that he was still holding out for the idea that the Pope was the head of the church, and therefore what Henry was requiring of him and of people like him, including bishops, members of Parliament, the entire establishment of the English state at that time, what was being required of them by their king was wrong. The person who was in the wrong here was the king. That's what they wanted More to say. And More claimed he never said that. He did, no one could deny it, refuse to take the oath, but he never said why. And he insisted that no one could know what was in his heart or in his conscience. No one could know that he thought that Henry was not the legitimate head of the church. No one could know what More really thought about the authority of the Pope, because he never said. All he did was refuse to take the oath. His defence, or at least a part of his defence, was everything else was an interpretation of his silence, his refusal to acknowledge why he had refused to take the oath. And no one could know that apart from him. No one could know his reasons, his intentions. They might be innocent. So what his accusers needed was something out of his mouth showing that they were definitively not innocent. And Richard Rich claimed to have that evidence. He went in to see More, and he said he and More had a conversation in which he put to More a series of hypotheticals to try and establish what was his position about the authority of Parliament and the authority of the king. And he said to Thomas More, what would you do if Parliament required you to take an oath because Parliament had made me, Richard Rich, king? So an oath to me as your king, because Parliament had decided that I am to be king. And More said, well, I would take the oath because Parliament can indeed require that of me. If Parliament requires me to swear my allegiance to the sovereign of my state, I will do it. Then Rich said, okay, well, what if Parliament required you to take an oath that said that God is not God? And More said, well, I couldn't possibly swear that oath. Of course I couldn't swear that oath. God is God. And oaths matter here. Everyone's taking seriously the idea that an oath is a really meaningful thing. You put your soul at risk if you swear on the values of your religion that something is true. If it is not true and you know in your heart it's not true, you are risking damnation. So More says, I couldn't take an oath that says that God is not God. That would be an entirely nonsensical thing to do. And then Rich claimed that Rich said to More, what about the middle case? The middle case is Parliament requires you to take an oath saying that your king, Henry, is the head of the church. And Rich claims that More or less established that for him, that was closer to the God case than the King Richard Rich case. That is, it wasn't something he could do. And Rich claimed that the phrase that More used is that is a double-edged sword. The requirement that I should swear that King Henry is head of the church is a double-edged sword. It's fatal for me both ways. It's fatal for me if I refuse to do it, because look, here I am in the tower. But it's fatal for me if I do it, because then I put my soul at risk. And it's that bit that Rich said showed that More was fully aware that he couldn't take the oath because it put his soul at risk. And More said that Rich was lying. He never followed that conversation through to its conclusion. He doesn't deny that the conversation took place, and indeed maybe that those hypotheticals were aired. But on the third one, More said, I did not go with him down the path to explaining why that third case is a double-edged sword. And he said, why would I, having refused to share what was in my conscience and in my heart with anyone, with priests or bishops, with my king, with the members of my family, with my wife or my daughter? Why, if I wouldn't tell any of those people what I really think, why would I spill my guts to Richard Rich? It's a pretty powerful line of defense. Rich played a similar role in the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, he testified that Cromwell had said to him or indicated to him that he was willing to be disloyal to Henry. It's not quite as dramatic, not least because in the case of More and Rich faced off in the courtroom. But it is the thing that connects their downfalls. Of course, the other thing that connects their downfalls, the other villain in this story, this pair of stories, the monster not in the room because he was never in the room when the really dirty deed had to be done, was the king himself. Henry VIII looms over these two stories, including the trial of Thomas More, like a kind of monstrous ghost. He wasn't there in the courtroom, but everybody was thinking about him all the time. His presence was everywhere. Because all of this, all of these stories, everything that all of these men were doing, including Richard Rich, was trying to work out what the king wants. Can we do what the king wants? And given this is what the king wants, how can we do it in such a way that it doesn't backfire on him or on us or on England? But all of it starts from the question, what does Henry want? What does he want of us? And it was in trying and failing to answer that question that More lost his life. So what did Henry VIII want of Thomas More? Well, to start with, what he wanted from him earlier on in Henry's reign and in More's public career was to be a kind of intellectual ornament. More was one of the great intellects, humanist intellects of the age, not just in England. He had a European-wide reputation. Indeed, Erasmus, the great humanist of the age, had, a long time before his downfall, in 1511, called Thomas More the Socrates of England. Now, that is quite a title. If you're king, you're going to want your Socrates to make you look good. And he used More in various ways, including when Henry wanted to take on this new heretical doctrine called Lutheranism and to write a book showing that Luther was wrong. He got More to help him to write it. As the defender of the faith, he was the defender of the faith in England, not yet the head of the church. But More was there as a good Catholic thinker, as a great humanist, to help Henry, who thought of himself as a true Catholic, a thinker, and maybe not a great humanist, but wanted to be one. More was there to make Henry look good. And he was quite good at that. So that worked fine for both of them. But then Henry wanted something else. He wanted help in dissolving his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, to having it annulled, because it had not produced an heir. He had convinced himself, by God knows what complicated psychological process, that the reason for this was that the marriage was not a real marriage because he had married the widow of his brother, and that went against various biblical injunctions, and so he was cursed in some way. It would never produce an heir, and he needed to produce an heir, so he needed another wife, and he then alighted on who he wanted to be that wife, Anne Boleyn. So he needed his men, and that included bishops and politicians and lawyers, to make this happen. First of all, it was the job of Thomas Wolsey, the great man of the age, to take the case to Rome and get the Pope to agree to this, and Wolsey failed. And in that failure, it cost Wolsey his career and ultimately his life, though he wasn't executed. But in his downfall, he died. Then it became More's job. More was Lord Chancellor at that point after Wolsey. And though he wasn't someone who was going to go to Rome, because he wasn't a cardinal, to persuade the Pope, his job was to make this happen, and he couldn't make it happen, but in a different way from Wolsey. Wolsey tried and couldn't find the means, couldn't find the tools to prise the king out of his marriage in a way that the Pope would accept. By the time it was clear that the king would have to do it for himself, and that meant a break with Rome and ultimately the creation of a church in England of which the sovereign was the head. Once it became clear that that was going to be Henry's route, More couldn't do it because he couldn't allow himself to do it. He thought it was wrong. For whatever reason, he said he would never say, but he did resign as Lord Chancellor. So rather than being brought down, he agreed that he could no longer continue in that role. He couldn't do the king's work for him, but he hoped that in withdrawing from public life in that way and making clear that he couldn't do the king's work, he was at least sparing himself from having to do worse than that. But thanks in part to Cromwell, and following the end of the king's marriage, his marriage to Anne Boleyn, Cromwell made sure that all of the leading men in England were forced to sign an oath declaring, one, that they would recognise any children born to Henry and Anne Boleyn as his legitimate heirs. So there would be no holdouts claiming that there might be a question mark over the second marriage, because what if the first marriage was valid after all? After all, it wasn't the Pope who annulled it. Anyone who was having those thoughts, Cromwell was determined to flush them out. But secondly, he also required in the Act of Supremacy that everybody would take an oath acknowledging Henry as the head of the church. And More couldn't take that oath. And that was, in the end, what he was primarily charged with. His failure to take that oath was an act of treason. It was treachery. And he was charged with treason. He insisted that in not taking the oath, he was not saying anything. He was not revealing anything. He was merely refusing to do a thing. But the difference between More and Wolsey before him and Cromwell after him is that Wolsey and Cromwell ceased to be of use to Henry when they ceased to be able to do their work, and their work was to be an instrument of his power. Particularly Cromwell, but Cromwell was the protege of Wolsey. They were in the same business, it's just one of them had a different route to the top, which included all sorts of clerical roles. But in the case of Cromwell, he knew he was only of value to Henry insofar as he was useful. He was a tool. And when the tool stopped working, as it did for Cromwell after his failures over Henry's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves, but also getting caught up in a series of diplomatic and court manoeuvres that backfired on him and threatened to backfire on Henry, when he stopped being of use, he was completely vulnerable. Henry didn't want Thomas More to be a tool of his power, and More stood down from the role in which he was, as Lord Chancellor, an instrument of Henry's power, when he realised he couldn't do it. But in the end, what cost him his life is he couldn't serve as a shield for Henry. That's what he wanted from Thomas More. He wanted him to be a shield for his, that is, for Henry's conscience. Henry knew that the world was looking at what he had done in England and thinking this is just pure Machiavellianism, and Machiavelli, by this point, not that long after he'd published The Prince, was already a byword for what the devil might do in this world. This was clearly someone trying to get his way and being willing to throw out the true religion in doing it. It was monstrous. And it was monstrous in part because it was being dressed up as a matter of faith and conscience, that the first marriage was wrong because it went against biblical injunctions. Henry was aware that many people would have a very strong motive not to believe that. But if he could get Thomas More, the Socrates of England, a man of principle, a man of conscience, to agree that he was the true head of the church, that there was a theological basis for this, that he wasn't doing this for Machiavellian reasons, but for the purity of his soul. If he could get More to do it, that was protection for his conscience. It's like a lightning rod almost for him. It's something in between the world's disdain and his own sense, probably suspicion, that the world might be right. More is protection for that, and More refused to play that role. In the trial of Thomas More, which took place before a jury of 12 men, probably handpicked, More tried in his trial to object to at least one of the jurors and was told, you don't get to pick the people who judge you in this case. There was not much expectation that the jury was going to be persuadable by anything that More said. I don't think Thomas Cromwell would allow it to go to a jury trial if he wasn't pretty confident that the verdict was already in. But nonetheless, in the trial, More was given a platform on which and from which to defend himself. And he put up a strong defense, a powerful defense in a way. It's quite a lawyer's defense. Some of it is quite legalistic. It was nothing like Socrates' defense. If More is the Socrates of England, that's not where the comparison lies. Socrates disdainful, contemptuous of the motives of those who are proceeding against him. Thomas More wasn't disdainful in that way. He wasn't wild and lashing out in the way that Socrates was in parts of his defense. But he also didn't try to come across as somehow outside or beyond the remit of this court. He tried to defend himself on the terms on which he had been charged. So this isn't Socrates, this isn't Joan of Arc. there isn't a fundamental mismatch, at least between the terms on which the argument could be had. It's a more conventional defense in that More tries to show in each of the sets of terms on which he has been accused that he is not to be described in those terms, that it is a misdescription, a misapplication of the law, that it mistakes, fundamentally misunderstands what the law allows and what the law demands. And in his defense, he says that he will defend himself in 4 parts relating to the 4 kinds of charges that are against him. In the end, because the last 2 relate to Richard Rich, I think you can collapse them into one. I think there are 3 parts to Thomas More's defense of himself in his trial. And we should say he's defending himself. He is his own lawyer in this case. And the other lawyers of England are lined up against him, except Thomas Cromwell, who's not in the room, but all of the leading legal figures in the land, including Richard Rich, who by this point has become Solicitor General. They are in the room. It's a lawyer defending himself against lawyers in front of a jury. Thomas More takes the charges one by one. The first, he says, the first thing that he is basically being accused of is being against the king's remarriage. So this is a charge against him for essentially betraying the king by not supporting him in the king's chosen policy, which was to get out of his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon and get into a marriage with Anne Boleyn and thereby produce an heir to preserve the sanctity and safety of the realm, would be the rationale, and his conscience before God, because the first marriage was wrong. It wasn't a real marriage. And on and on. The arguments go on and on. More said, I'm being accused of not backing the king up in this. And he doesn't say guilty as charged. He says, it is true, I did not support the king's policy. I thought it was wrong, it was a mistake. And I told the king that when I was the king's confidant and advisor, when it was my job to advise the king on matters of policy. And he asked me, what do you think, Thomas, of this line I'm taking? More says, I told him I couldn't support it. And his defense here is to say, is that a crime? Because what was my job? What was my role? What kind of an instrument of the king's power was I at that point? I was an advisor. Do kings want advisors who only tell them what they think the king wants to hear? Is that truly to serve your master, your sovereign? To only tell that person what that person wants to hear? No, More says, that would be a betrayal of my role. Kings need advisors who will tell them if they think that the king has made a mistake. That is the way to serve a king. And if it comes to a point that there is a fundamental difference between king and servant, advisor, of course, the servant is only a servant and he must make way, as More did make way. You can't stay in that position. You can't keep having the fight, saying to the king, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. That would be madness. But to say once, I do not believe, your majesty, that this would be a good idea. That was my job, More says. So you can't charge me with treason for doing my job. Actually, it would be more treasonous to allow the king to make a disastrous mistake, putting his kingdom at peril. Then the second charge against More related to the oaths that he was being required to swear, acknowledging the succession, but also crucially that Henry was the supreme head of the church in England. And here is where More makes a different kind of defense. He doesn't say, I said this, or I did this, or I believe this. He says, I will not tell you what I believe. You, to prove your case, have to show that in my heart there is malice. That's the phrase he uses, malice in the heart. That I am ill-intentioned against my sovereign. That I wish to state to the world that I do not believe that the things that are being required of us in this oath are true. And More says, you cannot interpret that from my silence, because my silence is just silence, and the law is a protection for the thoughts of individuals if they are not revealed. I do not willingly reveal them. I maintain my right to silence. So yes, it is true. Of course, More has to acknowledge, in a way, there is something unfortunate about the fact that he has not taken this oath. But that isn't treason. It would only be treason if it could be shown that in not taking the oath, in his heart, he had malicious intentions against his sovereign. But he says the failure to do something, the failure to make a statement, is not the same as the making of a statement. Silence is not an action. It is inaction. The third line of defense that he takes is that the key piece of evidence against him, and he says this to Richard Rich's face in the courtroom, is the evidence of that man. The evidence being that I went further than silence privately with him in a conversation that he is our only witness to, because anyone else who might have witnessed it is not in this courtroom. And it's his word against my word. And he says that I said that the act of supremacy was a double-edged sword. And Moore's defense there is straightforwardly that Rich is lying. Don't believe him. And he goes further. He says, if anyone is in peril in this courtroom, it is that man, because he has perjured himself, which means he has put his soul at risk. Moore doesn't say, and I haven't put my soul at risk because I've always done what I believe in my heart. Moore doesn't want to talk about what's in his heart. But he says, we can know of that man that he has evil in his heart because I know that he's lying. He doesn't know what I think, but I know that he is doing this out of malice because I was there. And then I think Moore makes a mistake. I don't think anything that Thomas More would have said in this trial would have got him off. But the defense, to read it through, and there's a long transcript of his defense, and it's very compelling. It's got the real energy of drama, not least because of the moment where Rich is in the firing line. And one can only imagine what expression Rich had on his face while this was going on, trying presumably to maintain a kind of haughty contempt, but also presumably absolutely furious to be patronized by this man in this way. It's dramatic, the transcript. It reads like it's authentic. And towards the end of his defense, Moore says, he's lying, but even if he weren't lying, I'm still not guilty as charged. I think that's a mistake because the way Moore's defense builds is, on the first charge, I was doing my job. On the second charge, you are going further than you can in trying to interpret from my silence what I believe. And then in the third, he gets really angry. This is just a lie. Now we're in the realm of perjury and lying, and there's a real passion to it. So it moves from being quite a legalistic defense to being a really passionate humanistic defense, one might say. It's about truth and lies. But then he reverts back to being a lawyer because he introduces a conditional, a hypothetical, by saying this man is a liar and it's he who's going to hell. And then he says, but even if he's telling the truth, he's not telling the truth, but let's say he were telling the truth, I still want to go back to point 2 and show you that even that statement, it's a double-edged sword, would not condemn me out of my own mouth. Because what am I saying? Were I to have said that? By the way, I didn't say that, but let's imagine that I did say that because I want to show you that actually this connects back to what I was just saying. He loses the passion and he sounds like a lawyer. And then, the jury was made up of non-lawyers. And presumably at that point, what they heard was, well, he just said it wasn't true. And now he's saying, well, if it were true, what was it true? Anyway, Moore's line at that point is double-edged sword means a couple of conditionals or hypotheticals, not a statement of fact. He's not saying this is the sword that's going to get me. He's just saying it's a double-edged sword because someone like me is trapped. I can't go forward and talk about my reasons for not signing the oath because that would leave me open to suspicion and to attack. And so I'm going to defend myself behind the shield of the law, which doesn't require me to say what I truly believe. On the other hand, it's a double-edged sword because there would be a risk that were someone to take the oath who didn't believe that the oath required of them something that was defensible, they might put their soul at risk. So a couple of ifs. If I do take the oath, there is a risk that someone, not me, but someone, puts their soul at risk. And if I or someone doesn't take the oath, there's a risk that they will be accused of treason. Damnation or treason, two terrible fates, either of which is possible under the terms of this requirement that we all take the oath. But at no point Moore says, in making that case, had I made that case, which by the way I didn't, would I have said what I think? I think that was a mistake. by that point, anyone reading it starts to think, what's just happened here? Why has he gone back now to this? He was really doing well, because Richard Rich is a nasty piece of work. And no doubt there were people in that courtroom who didn't like him any more than Moore did. But now we're in the realm of hypotheticals and counterfactuals, and something that he said is not true, he's now saying could have been true, but still wouldn't be true. It's being a lawyer that gets him, I think. Having said which, he was doomed from the start because the trial was a setup. It was a show trial. And it was a show trial in front of a jury, but I think the evidence that he wasn't going to get off is provided in the transcript, where we are told that the jury returned after 15 minutes. And I'm guessing that that was thought to be worth recording, because even by the standards of the age, that was pretty quick. This is a big case. This is an important case. And actually, the points that Moore was making are quite complicated, maybe too complicated, but there were a series of them. And 15 minutes is really quick to assess that body of evidence. So I think the assumption has to be that they weren't really in the business of assessing the evidence. At that point in the trial, when Moore has been condemned by the jury, found guilty, he knows his fate. He knows he is going to be sentenced to death. And in fact, the question is going to turn on what form of death: hanged, drawn, and quartered, or will the king be merciful and allow him merely to be beheaded? The court, when it hears the jury's verdict, moves to pass judgment. But Thomas More intervenes at that point and says it is traditional, once the verdict has been announced, for the defendant to be allowed to say something more before sentence is passed. And so the court allows him to say something more. And at that point, he becomes relatively unburdened or unconstrained. So in this case, the Socrates of England is a little bit like the Socrates of ancient Athens, in that the trial of Socrates passed through three phases, the record that we have of the speeches that Socrates made. First, in his defense, didn't work, the jury convicted him. Then, before sentence, the speech that Socrates made in order to, in theory, plead for a lighter sentence, but actually to express so much contempt that it almost guaranteed he was going to be sentenced to death. And then finally, after that sentence had been passed, his final speech, in which he talks about why sentencing him to death is actually no sentence at all, and his views about death and other things besides. So in each case, it moves through from his defense to something a bit more liberated, telling them what he thinks of the whole process, to something even more liberated, telling them what he thinks is the true value of being alive in the first place. Moore doesn't quite go through those stages, but there are the three parts in the transcript of the trial. In his defense, he then intervenes to say, before you sentence me, I'm allowed to say some things more. And then after he's been sentenced, he has one more go. And as it moves through those three stages, the argument shifts. In the bit between being convicted and being sentenced, Moore made a speech in which he said, okay, now I can acknowledge this was really political, in the sense that I am aware that a lot of what is going on here and what is going on in the background of this is more than we were able to talk about in this courtroom. And he said, this is what I feel. Now, I'm going to give you some of my, not theological views, but political views. I think that the act of supremacy goes against what is in Magna Carta. He didn't say that in his defense. He said it after he'd been convicted, because in his defense, it would have sounded more like treason. The king has broken the law of England. He says, what the king is doing for the English church, he doesn't name the king in this, so the king's advisors, let's say it's Cromwell. What people at Cromwell are doing for the English church would be like what would happen if a corporation like the Corporation of the City of London, of which Moore had a lot of experience, if a corporation elevated itself within England to the status that England is elevating itself within the Catholic Church. That is, you ought to be able to see that if someone did to you what you are doing to the Pope, you would consider that act treason. So it's a much, much stronger line of argument, liberated by the fact he is already effectively dead. And then, after the sentence of death is passed, he says something further. He says, not, this is what I believe in my heart, this is what is in my conscience. He never says that. He never says, okay, now I can finally tell you, I hate all of this. I think the king is himself a monster and he's going to hell. He doesn't say that. But he does say, you have to see that from the perspective of someone who is not just wrapped up in the affairs of England. What is going on in England is wrong, in the eyes of the world. He broadens it out from an argument about English law and the sovereign power of the English monarch, to say, you may be able to find some people in England who will tell you that the king's policy is lawful and godly, but you will not find one person outside of England, not one person within the non-English Universal Catholic Church who will agree that what Henry is doing is godly and lawful. And so what should a man believe who genuinely is willing to take the widest perspective and take in the perspective of the church to which we all belong, the true church? That church, for anyone who is not part of this story, knows what is right and what is wrong. So More doesn't say, I know what is right and what is wrong. He says, the church knows what is right and what is wrong, and what is happening here in England is wrong in the eyes of the church. He's not at that point trying to defend himself, which is a good thing because he has now made two somewhat contradictory arguments, in the sense that a big part of his defense was the defense of essentially private conscience. What is in his heart is not the business of the court. There is something more personal, in a way sacrosanct, which the court can't touch, which is More's own beliefs. And that will be where he will stand. He will stand on the ground of his unspoken beliefs, which are beyond the reach of the court. And then after he's been condemned to death, he stands on completely different ground, which is the ground of the universal perspective of the universal church, which can see that what is happening in England is wrong. So in a way, there are two perspectives here. From the earlier perspective, there is this big, bad thing, though More won't call it bad, that is happening in England. And there is something smaller that he is trying to protect from that thing. So the scale of it is the largeness of what is being asked by the English state and the smallness of the space to which More has retreated, which is his private conscience. After he's been condemned, he reverses this. The thing that is now small is England, and the larger thing is the church, the universal church. The broadest possible perspective makes Henry and the people around Henry look small. And so in the end, it's contempt, really. It's a kind of contempt for England, in which he's saying, on the one hand, England under Henry. So I'm not just paraphrasing, but I'm applying a subtext to his argument. He never condemns Henry, ever, in any part of these proceedings. He uses the phrase of his king after he's been sentenced to death in the name of his king, that the king has only ever shown him, I quote, unspeakable goodness, though presumably the word unspeakable was chosen for a reason. But the implication is that from one perspective, Henry is this kind of lumbering monster prying into men's souls. And from the other perspective, Henry is this little guy with ideas above his station. It's just the King of England, for God's sake, within the context of the whole church, seen from the perspective of Rome, from the perspective of the Pope. The king is just another uppity sovereign. It's like how the king would think of the corporation of the City of London if it got ideas above its station. In the end, I think More lives up to his billing as the Socrates of England because he shows contempt for the worldview of his accusers. In Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons, the play ends with the ultimate irony, which is that More's accuser, Cromwell, will also lose his head. That in the world of Henry VIII, the court of Henry VIII, no one is safe, no one is secure, and Boleyn will lose her head. The Boleyns who have risen will fall again. The only person who's safe, it seems, is Richard Rich. Richard Rich is untouched after he betrays More, untouched after he betrays Cromwell. He survives the death of his protector, Henry VIII, the man for whom he has done some really, really dirty work. He survives through the reign of Edward VI. He survives through the reign of Mary and all of the lurches and changes of fortune in England, the lurches and changes of religion in England. And he survives it all. He continues to prosper. He accumulates more property. And in the reign of Elizabeth, Richard Rich died in his bed, an extremely rich and powerful man. This is thought to be the ultimate irony. In Robert Bolt's play, he adds a line which I couldn't find in the transcript. So he gives More in his trial a kind of send-off to the people who've accused him, which I don't think he did. And that is to say, at the very end, I know what this was all about anyway. It wasn't about the oath. It wasn't about the act of supremacy. This is revenge because I wouldn't support the new marriage. This is personal. This is a vendetta. And I think Bolt is wanting to imply that More would have wanted to imply this is the Boleyns, who are known to be an extremely vengeful family. These are the people behind and around the new queen coming for me. But he didn't say that, unless it's not in the version of the transcript that I read, in his own trial. The final thing that Robert Bolt has happen in the play is he has a character all the way through it who's called the common man, who's just like the perspective on all these high events from just an ordinary citizen. He plays different roles at different points in the play. He's a servant. He's a boatman, ferrying them up and down the Thames. He's a juryman, so he also represents one of the ordinary people who condemned Thomas More. And he's the other survivor in the play. Everyone loses their head in the end. But not Richard Rich, nor if you're a common man, an ordinary man, you keep your head down. Don't get involved in this high politics. Do what you're asked. Put me on the jury. I think I can twig what they want me to do. They want me to condemn that guy and believe that guy. Well, it's not for me to think about these things. Job done. Get back to the business of just surviving in this ghastly world. The common man is also the survivor. But when I was reading about the trial of Thomas More, there was someone else, another case, another set of legal proceedings that in the end was the one that really haunted me, more than this case. I'd never heard of this person. I didn't know anything about what I'm about to recount. I read about it in following the thread of More's defence, because one of the things that More says in his defence is that he's been accused of committing the same crime as someone who had already been condemned to death for treason, and indeed would be executed a week before More was executed. And that was a bishop, Bishop John Fisher, who was another of the leading opponents of the king's policy, both the attempt to break from Rome, but also the policy over the marriage itself. And as a bishop, he didn't do the king's work, and he was increasingly willing to stand up to the king. And it was, again, like with More, a long, complicated, drawn-out process. Would the king really move against him, or would he allow his people to move against him? What would he be charged with? And Fisher survived longer than might be expected, but he didn't survive 1535 any more than More did. They both died in the summer of that year. And in More's trial, one of the things he was accused of was of being in communication with Fisher, and that they had agreed they would both adopt this defence, which was the defence of saying, we won't take the oath, but we won't tell you what we think. And to condemn us, you need to know what we think, what the intention was behind not taking the oath. And if we don't tell you, you cannot assume that. They both tried a version of that defence. And More was accused of having cooked it up with Fisher, so it was evidence of conspiracy. And More denied it. He said, though I have communicated with Fisher, of course I have, he and I were in no way part of a conspiracy. If you find that the two of us ever did anything in the same way or made the same kind of defense, it is what More called similitude of learning. That is, we're smarter than you guys. We are real scholars, theologians. We know what we're talking about. So if we end up doing the same thing, it's not evidence of conspiracy. It's evidence that we're probably right. It's both a good defense and a terrible defense because it's incredibly arrogant. I don't think the phrase similitude of learning was going to get him off. So I was reading about Fisher, also an extraordinary man, also, like Thomas More, a saint. They were canonized together in 1930 as the two great martyrs of this period of English history, the great Catholic martyrs. Fisher's story goes back to an event earlier in Fisher's life, which was very well known, much discussed, and caused a significant change in English law. And that was in 1531, when there was an attempt to poison Fisher. The previous year, a cannonball had been fired at Fisher's residence, and the suspicion was it came from the direction of the Boleyn family residence. The Boleyns were thought to be capable of firing cannonballs at bishops. That's the kind of family they were. They really were keen to get their way and to make Anne queen. The following year, there was a poisoning at Fisher's house. 2 people died. Fisher himself survived because, though there were lots of rumours about this affair, it was thought that maybe he was fasting on the day because he was a pious man. So he didn't eat the poisoned soup or poisoned stew. But 2 other people died, a servant and also a guest of the family, and many people got sick. And there was outrage in London. This happened in London, including Henry was outraged. Poisoning bishops, trying to assassinate bishops. But the feeling was Henry's outrage was a little confected because actually he was appalled by the thought that people might think that he was behind the poisoning. Because it was known by this point that Fisher was not going to do his bidding. Fisher was a real problem for Henry. And now someone's tried to poison him. The previous year they fired a cannonball. Now they're poisoning his soup. Reasonable people might think there was a plot against Fisher. Who wants Fisher gone? The king. And the king and the king's people want Fisher gone. So maybe Henry is in the poisoning business. And Henry was appalled that anyone would think this. His conscience needed protecting. It needed a shield. He needed to know, because maybe a little part of him wondered if he'd maybe suggested to someone that it might be nice if Fisher was out of the way. But he needed to know, and more importantly, the world to know, that he would stamp out on the poisoning of bishops, whatever their position on his marriage. He was there to protect his kingdom and the people in his kingdom, the good people in his kingdom, and that must mean protecting public order. Poisoning, which was a frightening crime, because it's easy for poor people, cooks, servants, to attack their masters if they can slip deadly poison into the soup. It's fear of servants. Henry was very conscious that he needed to make a stand. And so he required Parliament, and he went to Parliament, and he spoke in Parliament for an hour and a half in defence of a new piece of legislation, the Poisoning Act, which declared that poisoning was to be treated as a form of treason, and that this crime, the poisoning of the people in the household of his opponent, let's call him that, not mortal enemy yet, opponent, Bishop Fisher, was going to be treated as treason. So the treason was the attack on Fisher. That's how good a person Henry was, that he was willing to go that extra mile and include what had just happened to this man in whom he had lost a certain amount of confidence. He was willing to include an attack on that person under the heading of treason. And he really paraded his virtue in that speech before a craven Parliament that was going to do what the king wanted them to do. And so they signed it into law. And because poisoning was now considered treason, it was punishable by the sanction that existed for acts of treason, for instance, an attempt on the life of the king. And the punishment was to be boiled alive, to be killed by being put in public in a cauldron of boiling water. And by this point, someone had been arrested for the poisonings at the Bishop Fisher residence. He was obscure, no one had ever heard of him before. There's no record of him before this event. Obscure servant, possibly cook, or possibly just a sort of occasional worker in the kitchens of Bishop Fisher's palace. He was called Richard Roos. Because he was held under a charge of treason, he was given no trial. He was given no ability to defend himself. He was tortured. No one, I think, has any idea whether he did it or not. He claimed that it was a prank gone wrong. He was trying to make some of the other servants ill, and he had no idea that what he was doing was potentially deadly. Who knows what his defense was, because there's no public record of any of it. And there's just a record of what was thought to have happened. And thanks to Henry's intervention, he was boiled alive. He was boiled to death in public, and there is a record of that. In order to let the world know that Henry VIII was a good person who was not vindictive against people who were standing in the way of his marriage, and certainly wouldn't try and get rid of them by underhand means. In order that the world should know that, Richard Roos was boiled in public in a cauldron of water, the worst death imaginable, to show the world that Henry was a good man, to provide a shield for the conscience of Henry VIII. I mean, at least Thomas More got a trial, and Henry claimed that in his mercy, in his unspeakable goodness, he would spare him being hanged, drawn, and quartered, and he did, and he allowed him to be beheaded. Merciful king, unspeakable goodness, the unspeakable goodness of Henry VIII. A reminder that if you would like to hear the second part of my discussion of the trial of Socrates, including comparison between Socrates and Gandhi, that's available now on PPF+. Just click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com. You can find out everything you need to know about what's available. Next time, in Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about the trial of a queen, Mary, Queen of Scots, another extraordinary drama in which accusers and accused faced off against each other in the courtroom. It is unbeatable. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.